Ready yet? Okay. So today I'm going to pick up where I left off yesterday and talk about how we can learn about what systems have learned. Okay, because that's, after all, the whole idea of this. I'm particularly going to highlight recent work by my graduate student, Felipe, postdoc Marcelo, and Naki Stern. The work with Naki is also with Vijay Balasubramanian, who many of you may know. I think he visits here quite often. And then earlier work by Jason Rocks with Eleni Kadafori that was done in collaboration with Eleni. All right, so, God damn it. Okay, so statistical physics, right? Let me just remind you of this lecture plan. So yesterday I talked about fundamental principles for the design of new materials. And the idea of that really was to create ensembles that we can then study to learn about how function emerges as a collective phenomenon. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. Doug's lecture tomorrow is going to follow up on my lecture from today and yesterday, talking about the real systems, the electrical circuits that he designed that can learn, okay, adaptively and in a distributed fashion. And then tomorrow I will be talking about a totally different thing, how to do a different kind of statistical physics for the glass problem. All right, so let me just remind you what I mean by input-output problems, because that's the topic for today. How can we learn about how desired output, or these are really complex response problems, okay? So it can be as simple as I apply a strain at one part of the molecule, okay? Or one part of a network, and I want a desired strain somewhere else. Okay, so that it can be that kind of localized response to a localized strain. Okay, or it can be, in the case of the brain vasculature, a localized pressure drop. Okay, in response to a localized pressure drop far away. So we call that flow allostery in analogy to protein allostery. This is a review of yesterday, so I'm going rather rapidly. And just to remind you, the mechanical problem and the flow problem are really the same, right? And in both cases, you're minimizing something. In this case, you're minimizing the Hessian, okay? Or you're minimizing the energy, which can be in linear response expressed in terms of a Hessian with displacements. In the case of the flow networks, you're minimizing the dissipated power. This is the conductance. These are the pressure drops on the edges. And I can write that in terms of the discrete Laplacian. Okay, so the flow network is just a one-dimensional scalar version of the mechanical problem, which is a vector problem. Okay, so and the flow networks are identical, just to remind you, to linear resistor networks. It's just that in both cases, you're minimizing the dissipated power. It's just that voltage replaces pressure. Okay, so so that's what we have. All right, this time it worked. So artificial neural networks also solve, complex response problems of the same kind, and that you apply localized inputs here to a bunch of nodes, and then you get desired outputs over here. Okay, so it's really the same kind of response problem of localized outputs in response to localized inputs. It's just extremely complex in the case of something like ChatGPT. Okay, but it is the same kind of problem. And as I talked about yesterday, right, the key to solving these problems in a physical system is that you construct a learning cost function, which compares what I'm going to call the free target strain. In other words, if I apply the source and then I let the target be what it wants to be, okay, it's free. And then compare that to the desired target strain, which I'm going to call delta. And again, we don't know which is bigger, we square it, okay? And we minimize that with respect to the learning degrees of freedom, which in the case of a mechanical network could be the spring stiffnesses. In the case of an electrical network could be the resistances, okay, or the conductances on the edges. But because this is a physical system, it is coupled also to a physical cost function, which the one I just showed you. So for the mechanical networks, it's the elastic energy if I'm at zero temperature, it's the free energy if I'm at non-zero temperature. And that has to be minimized with respect to the node positions, okay? And these two things are coupled together, right? The learning cost function depends on where the nodes are, okay? So, and the node positions, or the energy, the elastic energy of a network depends on the stiffnesses. So if I change the stiffnesses when I'm doing gradient descent on this, okay, I'm going to unbalance the forces on each node. They have to rebalance. The node positions are going to shift. That's going to change the learning landscape. I then take a step in gradient descent the learning landscape, right? So these two landscapes are evolving together in this coupled fashion as I go downhill in both, all right? And then last time, right, the point of yesterday's lecture was to say that we have developed a systematic framework to replace, oh, and the same goes for the flow problem, right? It's the same thing. We replace, what's this? We replace the pressure drop or the voltage drop across a given target edge, for example, with, we want that to be the same as delta. So we minimize this, okay? And it's the same process of minimizing in this dual landscape simultaneously. All right, so the last lecture, I was talking about how we develop a systematic framework for replacing the global process of gradient descent in the learning landscape, okay, with local rules that accomplish the same thing, okay? And the local rule I gave you, there is actually a well-defined limit in which it is equivalent to gradient descent, all right? And that's really why it works. So that's what that was about. And that's the basis for Doug's lecture tomorrow, all right? But what I want to talk about today is when you have these problems, and it could be any one of these problems. It could be in the mechanical networks, it could be in real proteins, it could be in flow networks like the brain vasculature, it could be in Doug's learning circuits, okay? Any of these things, you know, what we're after, right, is to understand how the learned function, either allostery or some desired complex outputs, how do they emerge from and get some microscopic understanding of that, okay? And that's a really hard problem, right? As I said yesterday, it requires reducing an enormous amount of microscopic information just to the relevant quantities. That's a dimensional reduction problem. And we need to have the right quantities that allow us to bridge from the microscopic scale to the collective macroscopic function or desired output, okay? And this is one of those problems that is extremely resistant to statistical physics methods that, you know, people have developed over the last century. And the reason why for this problem, we're far from equilibrium and we have correlated disorder, as I talked about yesterday. Now, we avoided having a complex landscape in this case by going to the overparameterized limit where we have many, many more learning degrees of freedom than we have constraints that are imposed by the learning cost function. Okay, so because of that, our landscape is actually convex. All right. So why are these problems so hard, right? Well, remember that for proteins, right, there are 20 different amino acids, and the amino acid sequence is disordered, but it's correlated so that the protein can fold and also so that it can perform allostery desired strain here in response to strain over here. Okay, in the brain vasculature, we have 1 million edges, right? And again, their conductances are a form of correlated disorder. They are correlated by the ability to deliver blood flow to wherever you want, okay? Depending on what you're doing. And in the learning circuits, the same. The ability to deliver desired voltage drops to where you want, or voltages. So these are really hard problems. And so this is why we have decided to take a totally different approach. And this is what I call statistical physics in quotes, because it's not your normal statistical physics. Okay, and the first thing we need for that is ensembles. We know we need ensembles, and we need these designed ensembles. We need ensembles of networks that all accomplish the same thing. Okay, it's only when you have many, many examples we know that we can do statistical physics, right? And the kinds of examples that biology supplies us are much too limited. They're tiny compared to the ensembles we need to figure out what's going on. And this is why people have studied protein allostery now since the 1950s, okay? And really still there's enormous controversy. People do not understand the mechanism of allostery. It's still an outstanding problem because they have only had these very limited examples. So this is why we have spent all this effort to think about how to design new materials so that we have these ensembles. All right, so where do you start if you want to learn about learning? Well, you start with the simplest case in the most extreme limit, right? We all know that. So, so the simplest case is, for example, this case. So suppose I have a voltage drop here, okay, of 1. I'm going to just call that 1. And I want a voltage drop at the target, which is the same. Why is that the extreme case? Because that's the largest it can possibly be. We have something that's governed by a Laplacian single source. The biggest voltage drop you can get anywhere is the same as the source. Okay, so that's the maximum voltage drop you can get. And in that case, you can just look and see what happens. It's very interesting. The network develops 2 sectors, one where all the voltages are -0.5, and the other one where they're all +0.5. Okay, and so these 2 source nodes span that boundary, and the 2 target nodes also span that boundary. Okay, so this is how the system does it. Here's another example. Okay, this is periodic boundary conditions. So you see again, it has broken into 2 regions, 2 sectors. And you can look at every example, they all look like this, okay, 2 sectors. Now, these 2 sectors are separated by a boundary of low conductance edges. Okay, so that's what separates them. Okay, and when you think about this, all right, you think, well, how do I start thinking about this? Well, what you realize is that, oh, okay, sorry. How do we start thinking about this? All right, so the way people do it in machine learning, okay, is they look at the learning cost function and they look at derivatives of it. So for example, they can look at the learning Hessian, okay, so the second derivative of the learning cost function with respect to the learning degrees of freedom, which in this case are the conductances on the edges. Okay, so you look at this matrix, okay, you find the eigenvalues, find the eigenvectors. So the eigenvalues of the Hessian are the curvatures of the learning landscape around the minimum, right? We're going to a minimum of the cost function and we're sitting at the minimum and we have a distribution of curvatures in this very high dimensional phase space for the learning degrees of freedom. Okay, and the eigenvectors are the directions of those curvatures, right, in this high dimensional space. And this is much studied, okay? Lots of people in machine learning look at the Hessian. I had to say that they have not made much progress from it. But in these physical systems, it's different, right? Because the learning in the artificial neural networks, you have a fixed learning landscape. The learning cost function is just what it is. You can write it down. You can take the second derivative, expect into node weights. okay? But the landscape itself never changes. In our case, the landscape changes during learning. It is a different landscape after it's learned something from before because the nodes have moved, okay? Have shifted during that process. And what happens is something actually very dramatic in this extreme case. What you see is that the highest eigenvalue of the learning Hessian rises dramatically and develops a huge gap with the others. Okay, so that makes you look at that one. Okay, let's look at that eigenvector. Okay, and what does it look like? Well, that eigenvector is a set of conductances on the edges, right? And if you look at it, there are immediately pops out very low conductances along here. Okay, that's what I've highlighted in these white. Those are the low conductances. This is the eigenvector that corresponds to that eigenvalue. Okay, and what you see is this line of low conductances, exactly what I showed you before, which separates two different sectors. Okay, so that physics that we just could see right away in the picture when we looked at it is showing up in the highest eigenvalue and eigenvector of the learning Hessian. Okay, so that's great. Okay, but it's not what we want. Okay, why is it not what we want? Because really what we want, what I'd like to be able to do is to hand you or have Doug hand you one of his networks. It's learned something. And then you say, okay, you know, what can this network do? What has it learned? Yeah, it's already gotten an output that's quite close to what you want. And it's very rapid. I think Doug will show you more examples. It's very interesting how these things learn, the dynamics of how they learn. And we're just starting to look at it. But it's extremely interesting. And in more complex systems, you might have a many-step process, 2 steps or more steps when it learns one thing after another. Yeah, so and this is a very simple case. And so very quickly it got very close, and then it slowly gets better, okay, over time. Yeah, okay, as it's learning. Okay, so don't hesitate to interrupt the questions, please. Okay, so what we would like to do is to be able to figure out what the network learned, okay, or what's the microscopic stuff, without knowing what the learning cost function is. So we don't want to have to know what the learning cost function is. So we'd like to avoid using the learning Hessian, but I'm going to use it as a touchstone throughout this process, okay, that what the system learned is contained in this learning Hessian, and we can look at that learning Hessian and compare to that. Okay, so all right. So how can we learn the response? Okay, that what's the microscopics behind the underlying the response, okay, without using the learning cost function. Okay, so if you look at this thing, so what do I call the microscopic physics responsible for the response? Well, in this case, I would say it's this line of low conductances. It's this barrier of low conductances that splits this thing into 2 sectors. That's the physics. That's where the physics is, okay? And that's what we want to get a handle on for less extreme cases and more complex input-output problems than this. This is the simplest case, most extreme case. Okay, what if it's not so extreme? So when we see this, we see right away, just as in the last picture, right? There are 2 sectors, right? What was once one network, okay, has now split into 2. And so that's counting, right? We've gone from 1 to 2, all right? And you can see it doesn't depend on the shape of this boundary. I could put this low conductance boundary, it could take a totally different shape, okay? But as long as my source and target edges span the 2 sectors, I will get the same answer. So it doesn't depend on the shape of the boundary, it's a topological feature, all right? So that led us to ask whether persistent homology could help us. Now, persistent homology is a method that has been developed by topologists to find topological features that are robust to noise. In this case, we have no noise, okay? But we're trying to find, for example, if we're tuning the system not to delta equals 1, but 0.9 or 0.1, okay? We're trying to find the system will not break up into two sectors. It only breaks up into two sectors like this when in the most extreme case. So, but can we find the remnants of those sectors? Okay, that's what we're after for this less extreme case. All right, and that's what we use persistent homology to do. So let me just explain a little bit about persistent homology and how it works, since this is a school, right? So the idea is the following. Here's my network, and I'm going to take my network and I'm going to order all the voltage drops in order. Okay, so 0 is going to be the smallest voltage drop across an edge. 1 is going to be the edge with the second smallest voltage drop, etc. And here 22 is the one with the biggest voltage drop. Okay, now I'm going to do what's called the ascending filtration. So I'm going to start adding these edges from the smallest voltage drop to the biggest. So here's the 0th voltage drop, that's the smallest one. And now I add the first and the second, and I see the first and the second are connected to the 0th one. I'm looking for what are called connected components. This is 0 Betty number. It's called 0 Betty number. Okay, so these are all connected. So these are all part of the same thing. But now I see I come to this edge number 3, and it's not connected to the others. That means a new connected component was born when I added this one. So it was born at voltage drop 3. Okay, delta V3. All right, now I keep adding edges. 4 is not connected to either this one or that one. It created a new one. So another connected component was born at 4. I add 5 and 6. And now 4 joined in with 3. Okay, so at this point, we say the feature that was added when I added this voltage drop, delta V4, died when I added delta V6. That's death of the feature. Okay, all right. So you can go through this and you see that, in fact, everything dies and joins the initial connected component once you've gotten to the third one, the one that was added when I added the third edge, connects up to the first connected component when I add the 15th, delta V15. Okay, when I add edge 15. All right, so we can represent that now on what's called a birth-death plot. So here I plot the voltage drop at which a feature was born, and here I plot the voltage drop at which it died. Okay, so the one at delta V4 died at delta V6, one at delta V3 died at delta V15. Okay, and what you see, this is important because you see the further away it is from this diagonal, okay, that means the more edges were added between birth and death, the bigger the voltage difference between birth and death, and the more topologically significant it is, okay, the more robust it is to noise in this. So that's the idea, that features that are far from the diagonal are more robust topological features. All right, and now I can do the same thing going down. Okay, I can add the highest edge first, second highest edge, and I can look, and there was a feature that was born when I added edge 20 that dies when I add edge 15, and another born at edge 19 that dies when I add edge 17. Okay, so that's on the lower half of the diagonal, is coming down from the highest voltage drop. Okay, so that's how it works. I'm just giving you how to do it, the practical thing to work physicists. I'm not going into the mathematics of why. Okay.
Yeah, I have a question. Your target is the red circles, and the source is the red, and the greens are the one which is finally you're taking, right?
Yeah.
So instead of that, you could have taken another one where the voltage drop is 21. So what made you choose the green pair like?
That's, we set it initially. So
Okay.
so the idea is we take the network, the network that has learned this thing, we apply the source, okay? And then we look at all the voltage drops that we get. So this is analyzing the response
Right.
to the input.
And you pick up the one which has the maximum voltage drop as your green one, right?
No, the maximum voltage drop is actually 22.
No, to start with, that's 22, but then you pick up the next one as.
You're saying the next one happens to be 20. Yes, that's right. I'll show you. I'll show you what happens. You'll see, because you cannot see much at all. That's not generally true. It's extremely noisy. What you have to do is you have to look at the ensemble of networks before you start seeing features. Otherwise, you just see a scatter of points. It's a mess. Okay, so this ensemble approach is really critical, and this is what you get if you look at the ensemble. Okay, so I have here an ensemble of networks that have not been trained. Okay, and here I have the ensemble of networks that have been trained to have a response of 0.8. The target is 0.8 of the source. Okay, and what you see, and this is a heat map. Okay, so the darker it is, the more points there are. Okay, the more birth death points there are. This is from looking at thousands of networks that have all been tuned for the same thing. All right, and what you see immediately is in the tune system, you see a feature here at 0.8 in the descending filtration, and you see a feature that goes from 0 up to 0.8, okay, in the ascending filtration. All right, so you see this and you say, aha, persistent homology has information about what the system was trained to learn. It was trained to learn 0.8, and quantitatively, we see that appearing, okay? So now you say, well, we have both the ascending and the descending filtration. What do they give us? Well, the ascending filtration gives us these connected components, these regions, okay, that are connected with very small pressure voltage drops, okay? So the voltage is nearly the same in the connected component that emerges from there. So that's this picture where you're looking at the voltages, okay? That these are all the same here, these are all the same there, okay? That's what you get from going up, starting from the smallest voltage drop. But if you start at the top from the biggest voltage drop and go down, okay, what you find are the edges of low conductance, because that's where you get the biggest pressure drops, okay? So the ascending filtration and the descending filtration give you complementary pictures, but it's really the same information, okay? So in one case, you look at the cracks, and in the other case, you look at the sectors that are separated by these cracks. So it's the same information. Now, if you look at this, now I'm looking at the system that has been tuned to all these different responses, 0.1, 0.2, all the way to 1, okay? And you see these features appearing systematically, all right? That's really showing you the system, the persistent homology has the information that we want. So how do we extract it? So the problem is, if you look at all these connected components, if you look at these that come through, okay, it's a bit of a mess, okay? You just see this mess. This is for a system that's trained to response of 0.2, okay? And if you look, just take a line across this, okay, and look at the pressure difference of the edges that intersect this line, you'll see it has this rather, all these little barriers. So what we do is we coarse grain, and we coarse grain in terms of persistence. Okay, oh, that's my line. Okay, and that's my landscape across that line, but I can do it across the whole system. And what we really want is this. Okay, so what we need to do is coarse grain. Okay, we're physicists, we like to coarse grain. All right, and so what we do is we coarse grain in terms of persistence, how far we are from the diagonal in the birth death diagram. Okay, and so we basically iron out these little wiggles, okay, in order of increasing persistence, which is the same as the barrier height in this case. Okay, so we just smooth that out. And we stop when the two target nodes, just before the two target nodes join the same basin, and then we see these two, we see that structure, which is what we're after. And this works, okay? So here is a network that has been tuned to different target voltages. So here, the target voltage drop, this is the extreme case where the target voltage drop is 1. If I look at all the voltages in this orange sector, they're all -0.5. Okay, all the ones in this green sector are 0.5. If I look at the difference in the means, okay, the difference in the means of these two, it is exactly what has been tuned in, right? Here's a less extreme case. This is a target voltage drop of only 0.2. Again, I can look at the distribution of node voltages. And says pressures, it's for the flow network. So sometimes I'll say pressure, sometimes I'll say voltage, but they're the same thing, okay? So now these two distributions are starting to overlap. But if I look at the difference between these two, okay, it's 0.29. It turns out that if I look at the difference, delta here was, in this case, we tuned to an inequality. We said, we want the target to be at least 0.2. And in this case, it actually tuned it to be higher, 0.27, okay? And what came out, the difference in the mean pressures is 0.29 for the orange and the green, okay? And even in the case where the response is only 0.05 of the source, okay, 1/20th, okay, we still see that we can find these two distributions, and the difference here is very, very close to what was actually tuned in. It was higher. In this case, I think it was 0.117, okay, very close. Here's a case where we have one source, and I think we have 6 different targets. Yeah, 6 different targets. In this case, it makes several different sectors. And again, within each sector, we can look at the average node voltage, and that corresponds very well to what was actually tuned in. All right, so these are just pictures, but I can show you statistics. So this is for thousands of networks, okay? Now all tuned to have the same kinds of responses. And what you see is the means voltage within the sector, okay? The difference of this sector from this sector, for example, and comparing that to the target that spans those two sectors, that the actual voltage drop that was tuned in, it's very close to this dashed line, which is 1. Okay, so this is as a function of system size of the network, and this is a function of the number of targets. Now, this is quite interesting because this is a network of only 512 nodes, okay? And I can tune in as many as 128 different target edges successfully, okay? So, so it's highly tunable. So what you see in biology is only a small fraction of what you could do. In other words, you know, we could truly be multitasking. This says I could be multitasking. I have a brain with, you know, millions of nodes. I should be able to multitask it and do, you know, 100,000 things at once. But biology never gets to that maximum, right? It stays well below that maximum. So we can't multitask nearly as well as we think. Okay. All right. So that's flow networks. So it really works. It tells us quantitatively for flow networks what we want to know. What about mechanical networks? Well, mechanical networks are different. And why? Because strain is defined over a region, not over a single edge, like in the flow networks. And because it's defined over over a whole region, what you get when you go up in strain is not the same as what you get when you go down. Those actually give you 2 different pieces of information, okay? So, so we then extended this to mechanical networks. What we do is we define, instead of strain, what we use is something called the local root mean square displacement. And what that does is it takes a neighborhood, okay, and it measures the deviation of the node displacements in that neighborhood from rigid translations and rotations, because we don't want to count rigid translations and rotations, okay? And it reduces this all then to a scalar. Okay, so I have a scalar for each a node or each region. Okay, it's around a node, defined in a node, which tells me the deviation of the local neighborhood of this thing from a rigid body rotation or translation. How big is that? Okay, so that's what this quantity tells you. And then we can do the ascending and descending filtration. Okay, and we can do this again on thousands of proteins. Okay, these, because we're physicists, of course, they're spherical. So we have a source here and a target there. Okay, and what I'm going to define is two different things. One comes from looking at connected components of this local root mean square displacement in the ascending filtration, and the other one comes from the descending filtration. So in the ascending filtration, again, you get sectors, okay? And what you get are these sectors of nearly uniform strain. So these sectors actually behave as sort of as rigid bodies, okay? Moving relative to each other, okay? And what we want to look at is the significance of that sector. So what we're going to look at is a quantity, okay? I'm not gonna drag you through it. You can read, well, no, you can't. It's not submitted yet, but it's been sitting with, I have this great student, Jason Rocks, who did all of this. He graduated now 4 years ago. He's still working on the paper. He hasn't touched it for 9 months, but he has promised me he will submit it within the next month. So it's almost ready. It had better see the light of day. Because I really love this paper. Anyway, so you can't read about it yet, but I hope within a month you will be able to read it on the archive and it will be submitted. So we have these two sectors here colored red and blue, okay, that move as rigid bodies relative to each other, and how well that works, you know, how much like rigid bodies they are is quantified by this thing, okay, by a number, okay? But from the descending filtration, now the cracks have different information, and these are what are called, so in the protein literature about allosteric, you will see people talking about hinges and hinge regions, okay, and these sectors. So that's something that people have seen in actual proteins. Another thing that people talk about are strain pathways, that you can imagine that at the source, you just poke it, okay, and over at the target, it pokes out in some direction, okay? There's just this pathway that transmits strain from the source to the target. The significance of that, the topological significance of that is captured by this quantity, okay? So there are two quantities, one that captures the topological significance of hinges, okay? And the other one that captures the topological significance of these strain pathways. So now, as I said, we can make thousands of these, okay? And we can put them on plot them on this diagram where we have here the hinge scale and here the strain pathway scale, these two numbers, okay? And interestingly, they all fall on this upper half diagonal. What that says is that if you have a strong hinge, within that hinge, you will have a strain pathway, okay? And we find examples of all of the different kinds of allosteric mechanisms that are common in the literature. So some are like scissors, okay? Others are you know, that you do something here, you do something over here, and something big happens over here. Others are like shear, you know, shear bands, you know, with a twist. You know, others are these very well-defined pathways with not much of a sector at all. Okay, you see them all here. But the interesting thing is, each of these different examples, which you know you can find in the protein literature, okay, is not in a discrete clump. So people have tried to classify allosteric in terms of discrete mechanisms, but you can see it's not in discrete clumps. It's a continuum. This is a heat map again of all our different proteins and where they fall in terms of these two numbers. So each, okay. So the yellow has the most examples that fall in that region. Okay, and it's a continuum. Okay, so maybe that's why, people have been falling short, is because they kept thinking that they were in discrete clusters, and they are not. Okay, it's really a continuum. And this continuum should be characterized by two numbers. So then we thought, okay, we couldn't have discovered this without having our thousands of design networks. Okay, but now we have it. And it really just corresponds to calculate the local root mean square displacement with the source strain applied and without the source strain applied. So we can go to the protein database and we can look at crystal structures of proteins with and without the regulatory molecule bound, with and without the source strain. Okay, and we can compare them. We can calculate the local root mean square displacement for every atom in the protein. Okay, and we can see where they fall. So we can find 20 in the protein database for which you have both the structure with and without the source strain. Okay, with and without the regulatory molecule bound. And here are 6 of them. Okay, and where do they fall? They fall again in this upper half diagonal. Okay, now some of them don't. Some of them have these very floppy regions, but these very floppy regions turn out to have nothing to do with the function. They're just floppy regions. If you go to the next most significant thing, okay, you get over here, and then that corresponds to the actual target. Okay, so these are 2 that are corrected that way. Okay, so you can find this. It does actually work for proteins. Yeah.
Those springs here, I mean,
What?
with what stiffness did you model these springs in the protein?
Oh, we didn't. So that's the virtue of this. So there's a nice community of people that take proteins, folded proteins, and turn them into mechanical spring networks. Okay, those are called elastic network models. We didn't do that because we don't really trust it. But you can actually get nice information out of it. Okay, but we didn't do that. For this, all we needed was the crystal structure with and without the regulatory molecule bound. And then we just measure the local root mean square displacement for each atom. And we do this analysis. Okay, so we do not need to turn it into a bead spring model at all.
Mean squared is with respect to what? I mean,
With respect to not having the source strain. So with and without the source strain, with the displacement with the source strain compared to without the source strain is what we analyze. That's basically what we're doing in the other case. Okay. In our design networks. Okay, and it actually works reasonably well if you compare for example, the hinge scale, the overlap with the actual displacement, treating these sectors as rigid bodies. If you compare that overlap with what you actually get, it's about 80% once your hinge scale is reasonably large. Now it goes down here. Why? Because as you get up here, you start seeing these very fluid regions of the protein, which have very large displacements, but they have nothing to do with the target. They're not anywhere near the target. Okay, if you exclude those, then it actually remains high. Okay, so it actually works pretty well. So, so that's great. Okay, we're really happy with this. But all this time, I kept taking our design mechanical networks, and I would just wave them in Jason's face. And I would say, Jason, to do this, we still have to apply the source strain. And we're analyzing the response. What we really want is the structure function relationship, right? That's the holy grail for biologists, is to understand the connection between structure and function. Okay, but when we're applying the source strain, we're already looking at the function. So we're looking at the structure of the function, not the structure function relationship itself. Okay, so if I give you a network that has been designed to do something, can you now tell me what it can do? Right? That's really what we want. We want the structure function relation. All right, so how can we do that? All right, so we don't want to use our learning Hessian. Okay, we don't even want to apply the inputs, the source input. Okay, how can we do it? So this is when we said, okay, instead of looking at the learning Hessian, which is the second derivative of the learning cost function with respect to the learning degrees of freedom, let's look at the physical Hessian. Okay, the physical Hessian, which is the second derivative of the physical cost function, for example, the elastic energy, with respect to the physical degrees of freedom, the node positions. So this is just the dynamical matrix, if you're used to solid state physics, right? This is just the dynamical matrix of the system. Can we look at that, look at the vibrational modes of the system once it's learned something and figure out what it's learned? Okay, and of course, because I'm telling you this, that means it worked. All right, so why is this yeah. Oh, this was just totally out of place. Before I got here, I was supposed to tell you this. I was supposed to wrap up the persistent homology part, which is saying that what we're doing when we tune these edges at the microscopic scale is we're affecting the topological structure of the response, right? That's what the persistent homology told us. And it told us that the most topologically significant features are actually responsible for that function that this network has. Okay, and that works both for the mechanical and the flow networks and the electrical networks. Okay, all right. Oh, and yes, I just want to point out the dimensional reduction that was done in this. Okay, by the persistent homology analysis. What we did was we took all the strains of all the atoms, right, in these proteins, and we reduced everything down to 2 numbers in the case of the allosteric proteins, right? The strain pathways and the hinge scale strain. Okay, the significance of strain pathways and the significance of hinges. Whereas in the electrical or flow networks, it was just one thing, right? The voltage difference between the 2 sectors. Okay, so that is the dimensional reduction that statistical physics is supposed to do. And we learned really what is the important physics, okay? These strain pathways and these hinges, which we can then quantify from the microscopics. That's our goal, right? Of course, the next step in this, which we have not taken, is to then construct a theory based on these quantities, right? And I think that's a very interesting thing for the future that we're not there yet. Okay, so but we have found the right variables upon which to construct our theory. All right, so but now we want to do better. We want to avoid even applying the inputs. We want to just look at a network, like I was waving in Jason's face, and then tell you what this network has learned. Okay, so so here's the learning Hessian, and here's the physical Hessian. So in the case of the electrical learning circuits of Doug's, right, this would be the second derivative of the dissipated power with respect to the voltage on node alpha, the voltage on node beta. Okay, so this is just the analog to the dynamical matrix, the vibrational modes of the mechanical system. And as I showed you before, let's go back to that extreme case, right? Where if we looked at the learning Hessian, there was this one eigenvalue, this huge gap, okay, that developed here, okay, and this contained the function. Now let's look at the physical Hessian of the same system, okay? Well, as the system learns, what happens? The physical Hessian, there's a lowest eigenvalue that drops and gets lower. And that has a gap with the others, okay? And in fact, in this paper, okay, it turns out that you can show that the learning Hessian sort of scales as the inverse of the physical Hessian to the 4th power. So there is this inverse relation, so that the highest eigenvalues of the learning Hessian correspond to the lowest eigenvalues of the physical Hessian. Okay, I feel like I'm losing everybody because nobody's asking me
No,
questions. Okay.
is that an empirical observation or do you understand it?
This we can derive.
Can you give an intuitive argument as to why that how that comes about?
Not give an intuitive argument for why that's the case. Yeah, I've looked at I've worked through the calculation, but I have to say that I do not understand it well enough to give a physical argument. So no, I don't understand it. That means I don't understand it. Okay, I've worked through the math, but yeah, there ought to be some reason why that's true. Okay, yeah. No, it's the direction of lowest curvature in the physical landscape around the minimum corresponds to the direction of highest curvature in the learning landscape around the minimum.
Okay.
So I guess maybe that's the idea, that the highest one is the most constrained in the learning landscape. In the physical landscape, the way you get that is by developing a mode that's more floppy.
Yes, so if probably it's easier to make it learn because it has more degrees of
Because
freedom.
it's floppy.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it can move around, and probably that's the reason that's the one which learns first and kind of separates out in the
Yeah,
in your learning haste.
in the learning. Yeah, so I guess that is the physical, some physical intuition as to why it's the lowest one that's coupled to the highest one there. Yeah, Sana. Wait, you need the microphone.
I'm wondering if
Yeah, it was on.
information
no,
that
it's not
we
on.
can talk about for the fourth time. Is there any information in the eigenvector that you can look at? And does that say something about pathways or anything like that?
Yes, so that's what I'm going to talk about next, that the eigenvector, just as the eigenvector of the learning Hessian showed us that low conductance barrier between the two sectors. Okay, the eigenvector corresponding to that eigenvalue of the Hessian, physical Hessian, tells us what's happening exactly. Okay, so that floppy mode, that soft mode or softer mode, right? It's not totally soft, but it is developing a gap with the rest. Is very informative. And okay, here it is for a more complicated problem. So this is one of Doug's networks. Well, it's a simulated version of Doug's network. Okay, that has learned linear regression. It's learned to solve two equations for two unknowns, two linear equations for two unknowns. And what you see in this case, there are 4 eigenvalues that have clearly separated from the rest. Okay, and there's some here that have lowered. Okay, the lowest eigenvalues again have decreased, and again we're seeing that correspondence. All right, so it turns out that not only as the system learns in the physics, if you look at the physical Hessian, not only does the lowest mode decrease, okay, but its projection onto the learned response, onto the response increases. Okay, so that soft mode is actually the direction of the response. That's the answer to Sanat's question. And so that's great, right? Because that can tell us what the response is. So how do we pull it out, especially in a more complicated case where you have linear regression or something like that? Okay, what we do is we start out with the low eigenvalues of the physical Hessian, the ones that clearly come down, okay, the lowest ones that come down as you learn. Okay, so we take that subset of the eigenvalues, and then we construct what's called the maximally localized basis. People do this in quantum condensed matter. Okay, so this tells you how spread out the eigenvalue, the eigenvector is. Okay, r squared minus r, the average of r squared. Okay, so that tells you the variance of how and so it tells you how spread out it is. You minimize this functional, okay, and you get a new basis, which is called the maximally localized basis. So here's your original basis. I start out with just these 5 eigenvectors. Okay, this is the uniform translational one, just changing all the voltages up and down. Okay, and then these are the next 4 non-trivial ones. Okay, you take these, you form the maximally localized basis, and you get these. Okay, you get sectors appearing, in fact. Okay, in these maximally localized eigenvectors, and if you look at these, like each one individually, okay, I have this sector. If I look at the voltage difference across each edge of the network, okay, from this picture, so these are pictures of voltages. Now I look at voltage differences across the edges. What you see is that some are bigger. And if I square that, so I don't care which are positive and which are negative, you see these regions of high voltage drop, okay? These lines of high voltage drop emerging, okay? We can combine the results, combine all these different little high voltage drop wiggles, okay, into one picture. We do some filtration. I'm not going to go into too many of the details, but what in the end, what you get is a picture like this, okay, of when we just paste all these boundaries together from these modes. Oh, this was sort of the details. I don't think it's worth it to go through it. It's too technical. But the point is that once we do that, okay, what do we get from the physical Hessian? We get, for the extreme case, we get this, okay? These are the highest voltage drops. These highest voltage drops correspond to the low conductances from the learning Hessian, okay? These two are the same. The gray ones here are edges that appear in both this and this. Okay, so that's the overlap between the two. And in this extreme case, it's perfect overlap. Okay, so the physical, what I'm just trying to tell you is the lowest eigenvectors of the physical Hessian have the same information as the highest eigenvalues of the learning Hessian. Okay.
Andrew?
Yeah.
Yeah, just one question. So when you get the few lowest eigenvectors with the participation ratio and trying to see which part of the system is going to contribute to that, does it give out a picture of these 2 regions?
Yes, you can see those maximally localized bases shows you the sort of sectors, exactly those sectors that appear for this case. Yeah, exactly. The maximally localized basis gives us this region and that region. Yes. Okay, but now if we do something that's less extreme, okay, or we do or different target voltages at different targets, okay, what we see is a somewhat different picture from what we got from the persistent homology. So here's an example where I have one source edge and I have 2 different targets. So the targets have little target symbols on them. Okay, that's the source edge. There are 2 target edges. And what you see is this. It's a low conductance barrier, but it doesn't fully separate the thing into 2 sectors. In the persistent homology, I forced it to separate into 2 sectors, and it would put a boundary somewhere in here, okay? And then the average within that sector would be, and the average within that sector would pretty well capture the voltage difference across the targets, okay? But you know, in this case, it says, oh, I don't actually have to separate completely into sectors. I just form this low conductance barrier. And what I'm doing is this barrier is redirecting flow in my system. And by redirecting the flow, you know, I'm sending flow around these barriers. That's how I tune my targets. Okay. So, and we see this is a different case where I have one source edge and I have 2 target edges, okay? This time tuned to 0.1 of the source, or no, it's not 2 target edges. This is 5, I can't count, 5 target edges, okay? Oh, I see. I didn't do this. 5 different target edges, each tuned to a different pressure, voltage drop, which I didn't list here. This is just wrong. Okay, so each tuned to a different voltage drop, and it accomplishes that by setting up these little barriers to the flow. Okay, through the system. And here's a case that, oh yeah, okay, yeah, here it is. Here's that example. Okay, here I have 3 different source nodes. I have ground. Where's ground? Ground is here. Okay, I have 0.6 volts. That's here, and 1 volt here. Those are my 3 sources. And then I have targets. Okay, 0.1, 0.1, 0.4, 0.5, 0.6. So I have all these different targets that are tuned to different things. And again, it's redirecting the flow. It's setting up these little boundaries. Now, again, the black ones are the ones we get from the physical Hessian, the low conductance edges that we get from the physical Hessian. The white ones are from the learning Hessian. And you can see in this case, the overlap is not perfect. There's some that appear in the physical Hessian. There are others that only appear in the learning Hessian. Okay, but the gray ones appear in both. But it's pretty good. Okay, you see the main features of these low conductance barriers you really are seeing from the physical Hessian. So this is one I like. This is solving 2 equations for 2 unknowns. So these are the 2 equations. Target 1, which is here, is 0.15 times source 1 plus 0.3 source 2. And this is the solution, how it does it. Okay, what it does is there's a barrier that isolates it from source 1 more than source 2. And that's why the coefficient from source 2 is bigger than for source 1. Okay, and the opposite for target 2. Target 2 doesn't have a barrier to source 1, but it has more of a, it has a longer distance to go from source 2. Okay, so by playing with all of this, right, these little barriers and stuff like that and distances, that's how the system accomplishes this function. So, all right, that's really the main thing that, our whole idea is that what we need are ensembles of networks that have learned the same thing. Okay, but that is the crux. You need these ensembles. Okay, and once you have that, you can say, what do they have in common? You can look across thousands of examples, say, okay, what do they have in common? So this is a way of using big data to do statistical physics. Okay, it's not our usual way of doing statistical physics. Okay, but we can hack our way to get insight, and so that we know where to start building a theory. So either with the persistence homology analysis or the Hessian analysis, right? We've identified what's important, which are these low conductance barriers. That's the key. And so that's the dimensional reduction, that we took all of this information. We said, what's important are these low conductance barriers and how the system sets those up. Okay, so the thing that I want you to take away is we didn't need to know the learning cost function for this, right? In artificial neural networks, the only thing they have is the learning Hessian, or what they call the neurotangent kernel, which is first derivative. Okay, I'm not going to go into it, but it's they do these analyses and they try to get insight. It's not very successful. And why is it not very successful? It's not very successful because in the case of an artificial neural network, the landscape doesn't change during learning. In the case of a physical system that learns something, because the physical and the learning landscapes are coupled, the learning landscape actually changes during the process. And it becomes actually more informative of what the system has learned, okay? So, so from the learning Hessian, we can get much more insight than people can get from artificial neural networks. Now, it's okay that they rely on the learning Hessian. I said I didn't want to. For them, it's okay because they needed to know the learning cost function in order to train in the first place. They couldn't have trained without learning the learning cost function. We don't need to know the learning cost function in order to train, so we'd really rather avoid it, okay? We can just learn by example, right? We just show it training examples and it learns things, and we don't need to know we don't need to construct a learning cost function. And so with the physical Hessian, we can get insight into what it learned without knowing the learning cost function, without even applying the source. We can just look at the network as it is and say, aha, this network has learned something. It's got these low conductance barriers that are set up. Okay. So that's saying that these low conductance barriers, this is brand new, this insight. Okay. But the next step we'd like to do is to say, okay, now I've got low conductance barriers. How can I set these up in order to learn something? And can I construct a theory for this based on that insight of having low conductance barriers? Those low conductance barriers is where information is being fed into the system, right? Remember, I didn't say this last time, but I want to make this point that this is an active system, okay? When the physical, at each step of learning, the physical landscape, you're relaxing to the minimum, right? The energy wants to relax to the minimum, okay? But then you do a step of coupled learning, you do this coupled learning, this local rule on the edge, and you drive it away from equilibrium again. And then it relaxes and you drive it away and relaxes, okay? That's how you're feeding information into the system that somehow allowed learning to emerge. That now it can learn how to do classification or linear regression or nonlinear regression. It can learn to do, in principle, anything that an artificial neural network can do, okay? But it's done in this totally different way by local rules. And those local rules are the active element. It's an active system matter. It's active matter in a totally different sense from the active matter that people usually study. But I think it's very interesting. Okay, and if you just remember one thing, I want to remember this, that it's learning is sculpting both landscapes, both the physical landscape and the learning landscape. It turns out that in biology, in things like population ecology and so forth, they have this concept. It's called, actually it was developed by a colleague of ours at Penn, Josh Plotkin, in biology, and it's called global epistasis, that evolution actually sculpts the learning landscape and that the learning landscape contains this information. It's totally different from learning, again, that's done because it came through evolution and it's a real system which coupled to all kinds of physical constraints, which, you know, artificial neural networks don't have. So, you know, if you think really physical learning is a great paradigm for even how things have evolved in evolution. So it's anyway, it's a place to start, and that the sculpting of both landscapes is leaving these detectable signatures that tell us the microscopic physics responsible for the collective phenomenon of learning. Okay, so that's it. These are the people who did the work, and I want to thank. Thank you for your attention today.
Questions?
So in case of physical cost function, you have a like fixed set of conductance, and you basically minimize the node potentials. And in case of learning cost function, you do the opposite. Like given the voltage, you minimize the conductances.
You minimize the power. You minimize the power that's dissipated with respect to the conductance.
So like, why don't you write like a function which contains both of them?
I'm sorry. Let me say this. Let me say this right. The physical cost function in the case of the circuits is the dissipated power, and that's minimized with respect to the node voltages. Okay, so node voltages adjust to minimize the dissipated power, and that's what gives you Kirchhoff's law at every node. Okay, so that's what the physical cost function is doing. The learning cost function is whatever you want it to be, whatever you want this thing to learn. Okay, and it's minimizing that by adjusting the conductances on the edges.
But what I was asking is, why don't you write like both the cost function together and minimize with respect to two variables?
Yes. So in fact, Pankaj Mehta has a very interesting set of notes that he shared with me very recently, where he argues that the most informative thing are the off-diagonal terms. So I have the second derivative of the learning Hessian with respect to the learning degrees of freedom on one diagonal. I have the physical Hessian, second derivative, the physical cost function with respect to the physical degrees on this, but I could have the second derivative of the learning degrees of learning cost function with respect to the physical degrees of freedom, or the second derivative of the physical cost function with respect to the learning degrees of freedom on the off diagonals. And he says that those are even more informative. Okay, so we have not looked at those yet, but but you're right. That's what he's found, is that that's even better. But we don't want that, actually. I mean, it's great. I mean, we will look at it, absolutely. But we want to get away from knowing the learning cost function. Okay, because our system can learn by example. So we don't need to know the learning cost function. Yeah.
Hi. So your system learns by like forming these high and low conductance domains separated by like very low conductance walls. So it's basically differentiating into subgroups in some sense. So I could not help but feel the analogy between brains, in which like brain has been differentiated into learning like specific, for example, if you have a visual cortex that is devoted to learning some subset of things. And yeah, so is there any analogy between like brain domains and brain differentiation and this?
Yeah, this is one of the things that, of course, popped into our heads. Oh, this is really cool. The brain has these different regions that do different things, and maybe that organization is not coming about so much from the structure of how the neurons are connected, not the connectome, okay, but from the connectome of the response, but from these regions, these regions that appear from the response. So or in the physical Hessian, you know, we have no idea. Okay, the brain is really complicated, and we know no neuroscience. So I'm, you know, Sid Nagel has this thing he calls the bullshit line, that everything I said up till now is backed up by something. It's based on a calculation or something, so please believe it. But now I'm descending below the bullshit line, and yes, we hope that there's some connection with that, but we have no idea. But I think that's very interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. So in the cases where there are multiple source nodes and multiple target nodes, so are they correlated, or we can move one source node and we can get the movement only at the one target node?
Wait, if you change one source?
I mean, so source node, are those all nodes are correlated or connected, or are they independently, they can be moved?
Oh, they're randomly chosen.
Mm-hmm.
So in the circuits, they just sort of choose source nodes and choose target nodes and do it that way. So they're not chosen with any, you know, previous thought.
Okay, and one more thing I was wondering, that let's say if since there are the boundaries of flow potential, so is it possible that you have one source node, and let's say you want two target nodes, and you include a switch at the learning point, and by making switch on and off, you can move the boundaries? Is it?
So wait, a switch for what? Let me make sure I understand what you're asking. Can you say that again?
Yes, I mean, let's say if there are two target nodes, then so movement at independent movement. So let's say it switches on, then target mode node A will be active, or the target mode B will be active. Then.
Oh yeah, we can do that. Yeah, we can do that. So for example, we can have target one respond to the source, and target 2 does not respond unless another source goes, these 2 sources, and then target 2 lights up and not target 1. We can play all these different games. And Jason actually showed that in the mechanical networks going way back, that you can do these sorts of switches and these sort of logic operations. It does actually work. Yeah. What's even more interesting, Doug will show you the second generation of circuits tomorrow that has nonlinear IB characteristics on the edges. So depending on your voltage, you can have different resistances across that edge. And so you have different barriers that are set up according to what you're trying to learn. So for example, XOR, there are 4 different cases: true, 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 false, et cetera. There are 4 different cases. And each case in the end uses that nonlinearity because it's a nonlinear input-output relation. And so you'll have different barriers for each case. So that's sort of fun. And we haven't started to look at that yet with this. This is really quite new. I just had to show it because I'm excited, even though I haven't fully digested it.
Further questions, comments? Then let's thank Professor Lu once again.